Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello friends, welcome back to this lecture number 20, which is the final lecture in the series on psychology of language. Now over the past 8 weeks and 19 lectures, we have made a journey starting with understanding what is language and traversing through the various characteristics of language, looking at it from a psychological viewpoint and ending the whole series with a debate on bilingualism, which is people who are primed to speak two languages together. Now frankly speaking, there are very few monolinguals in the world. People generally are bilinguals, and there are several reasons for it, because English has been pushed as the official language. So people are bilinguals, and so we decided at the end of it to look at bilinguals. The subject matter of today's lecture would be to review all these 19 lectures to understand what we have done in all these 19 lectures and describe in detail a little bit about all the 19 lectures or all the 9 units, 9 modules that we have covered. Now I have been doing reviews all along on all the lectures, but they had been very brief reviews just to provide you the context of what we have been through. Today's lecture, we will look in detail into each section that has gone into all these 9 modules and 19 lectures in total. So this is a bit different from what we have done in all the past lectures in terms of reviewing the lectures at the beginning of each lecture. So the question is, why did we start this course at all? What was the need of starting this course? And as I explained to you, the need for starting this course was to look at language and to understand language from a psychological point of view. Now the question would be, why language? Obviously, the most interesting fact or the most interesting way of communicating between two people is language. And so what I thought was, why not give a shot at understanding language or introducing language and looking at how language as a cognitive system has developed. So what we will do right now is we will review all those 19 lectures and 9 modules one by one and provide you some details onto what we did in all these lectures. We started off the first lecture by rounding off or trying to understand what is language and is there a more easier way to look at language, and we found out that there is, and that process is called the communication. So we started off by looking at what is communication. We went a little bit further than that and needed to understand why do people need to communicate, and the idea is that since more than one people are available, since the world is filled up with numerous people, they need to exchange ideas and they need to exchange thoughts between them, and the only way that can be done is through language. The language could be a formal language, it could be an informal language, and the easiest form of language is a communication, and communication also have rules like language. So we started off by looking at the basic communication system, the most primitive form of communication system, and there we focused on something called the animal communication system. We started off by looking at what an animal communication system looks like. We looked at why animals communicate, and some of the issues that we discussed is that animal communicates for food, for shelter, for the idea of reproduction, for the idea of restraining themselves or warning against predators, and so many reasons why animals communicate. We looked at some forms of animal communication system, for example the honeybee wangle or the call of the vervet monkeys, and we saw how these communication systems are designed and what is the purpose of a communication system like this. We looked at communication system, animal communication system in terms of these characteristics, and we found out that the most primitive form of animal communication system or the most primitive form of language, which is the animal communication system, has some basic characteristics. For example, limited range is there, number of ideas that can be exchanged is very limited, the hollow phrases are used, and so not suitable for any situation or most situations. Recursion idea is not there, so animal communication systems cannot be combined one after another to mean larger ideas, and animal communication system is always dedicated to right here right now, it cannot tell us about future and past. And so once we had an idea of what animal communication systems is, we moved on to something called what is the human language system like. So we started focusing on the human language system, and then we saw what are the main characteristics of a human language system. We found out that human languages are generally governed by some kind of rule, although animal communication systems are also governed by rule, but mostly those rules are not defined. In terms of human language systems, the rules are well defined. Human language systems have structured components, and they use something called arbitrary systems. So all these features are features which are different from the animal communication system. Also, animal communication system and human communication system for that matter, specifically the human communication system, has three form of exchanging, It could be a vocal mode, it could be a manual mode, or it could be a visual mode of exchange. We looked at something called duality of patterning in human communication systems, which basically gives the language its expressive power. What is duality of patterning means? Taking smaller units, combining them to form bigger units. So combining phonemes into phones into phonemes, and then phonemes into morphemes, and so on and so forth. So basically this is called the duality of patterning. We also looked at how the human communication system starts with phonemes and then goes to morphemes, and then goes to the idea of words, then sentences, and then sentences into higher level discourse and pragmatics, and so on and so forth, and so how this system is built up, this pyramid of human language is built up. We also looked at how animal systems make us talk about not only just here and now, but also talk about things which are in the past as well as in the future. Now once we had an idea of how the human communication system is, we jumped into looking at a little bit into the evolution of the language systems, and there we looked at how the Homo erectus and the Neanderthals they developed the language system. We looked at the process of recursion, which is extending pattern by placing patterns in itself and forming larger patterns. This is basically recursion, and this is very one way of explaining how language would have evolved from lower systems. Also we looked at the discontinuity and continuity debate, which explains how language would have evolved, and we looked at theories, discontinuity and evidences with discontinuity and continuity theories to prove how language would have evolved from the basic patterns which are there. For example, the idea of fox progene, the idea of pidgin, which basically explains how language would have evolved either as a continuity form or in the discontinuity form. Discontinuity form, we looked at the idea of fox progene, the idea of disparity between human languages and animal languages. They say that the evolution is discontinuous of language, whereas the continuity theories, they look at the idea of natural selection and the existence of pidgins, which says that the language development is a continuous process. We also looked at the social learning theories of language, and how these theories back up the idea that language would have evolved from basic structures. And lastly, we looked at some fossilized evidences for language. We looked at how pidgins are simplified language, and they provide big evidence to the fact that language would have evolved or language, so evolution of language and fossilized evidence. We looked at how the language evolved from smaller structures. We looked at how most pidgins have some basic characteristics. For example, they have simple phonology, they lack complex morphology, they are limited vocabularies, they do not have syntax, and they are effortful to produce. We also looked at how teaching of language was difficult, and since animals did not have the right apparatus to learn language, and that provide us some idea of how language would have developed. The simplest form would have developed to the highest form. And by looking at brain damaged peoples, we had some idea of how language, how those evidences, the fossilized evidences exist that language would have developed out of evolution. Now once we had some idea of the nature of language, the obvious second reason was to how to study language, and there in how to study language we started looking at the scientific method for studying language. We looked at how theories, hypotheses and things like problems, observations, all of them are connected through deductive and inductive reasoning, and how this whole research cycle actually flows. We looked at naturalistic observation, the correlational method, the experimental method for doing research, and that basically gave us a brief understanding of the scientific method for studying language. Next, we looked at experimental designs. We focused on two primary forms of design. We focused on something called the within subject design and the between subject design. Now, in between subject design there are two different groups on which the testing is done. So, if I am looking for some property, some group with a language property and some group without a language property, and so two different people come and do our experiments, this is called a between subject design. If the same subjects are repeated across both the conditions, this is called a within subject design. So, we looked at different kind of experimental design. We looked at what an experiment is all about. We looked at the experimental processes and how an experiment is structured and the designing of experiment. We looked at behavioral techniques on behavioral measures in psycholinguistics, and so we focused on two behavioral measures. One is called the latency, which is also called reaction time sometimes, and then we looked at something called the accuracy, which is how accurately or how correctly you are able to reproduce something. So, we looked at these two measures of language or the language experiments. And lastly, we looked at something called language in the brain. So, we looked at various forms of brain related language interfaces. So, we looked at the Broca and Wernicke area in the brain which is dedicated to language. We also looked at several techniques of measuring the brain patterns while a language is produced, and we looked at in some detail into EEG, the MRI and the ERP as measures of the brain activation when a language is produced. And so, this brought us to a point where we had some understanding of what is language and how to study language. Now, once we had this idea of what is language and how to study language, we obviously needed to make this point clear of how language is produced. Now, the very primitive form of language is the spoken language. Of course, we do have reading and writing as language, but these are newer systems, as we will see in the section of reading and writing. The reading and writing things or language as written form is newer. People did not have this form of language. Now, think about the prehistoric humans. They only used to speak, they used to produce vocalized sentences and they used to speak, they never used to write. Reading and writing came off when people started settling together. So, earlier humans were nomads and they did not need this reading and writing thing. Of course, they did have some kind of symbols, but that was not a full fledged language system. And so, the first form of language or the most primitive, most basic form of language is the spoken language. So, obviously, we started looking at what spoken language is all about. We started looking at how, I am sorry, so a little bit about auditory perception. This is a repetition slide, so I have to cut it out. So, we started looking at how auditory perceptions are there, or what does auditory perception really mean. And in auditory perception, we started looking at what is sound, right, and what does the sound wave comprise of. How the sound is comprised of the frequency and the amplitude, and how this frequency and amplitude they mark the sound, because when we talk about spoken language, it is all about the sound. So, we started looking at the parameters or the characteristics of a sound, and we looked at the two basic characteristics of any sound is the idea of frequency and the amplitude. We looked at how this spoken sound, which is kind of a vibrating object, which is kind of a vibration which comes from the vocal cord, how they have something called the fundamental frequency and the overtones and so on and so forth. We started looking at how this vibration has, or this vibrating sound has something called periodic and aperiodic sounds. We also looked at the organ which is used for perceiving this sound. So, if I produce this sound, obviously you are going to hear this sound, and this hearing of this sound is basically what is called auditory perception. So, we looked at that apparatus which is able to hear this sound, and that is called the human ear. So, we looked at how the human ear is designed, and we looked at how the cochlea of the human ear and cochlea in the inner ear and the basilar membrane which is in the cochlea that perceives the sound. So, how there are hairs which is floating in the cochlea and the tonotropic organization of the basilar membrane, and how this picks up each tone of sound and interprets them. We looked at how the primary auditory cortex is located and how they have connection to the basilar membrane, and we also look at the fact that we cannot just recognize things or objects by just the sound of it. So, in auditory perception we looked at the properties of the sound and the properties of how the sound is composed of. The next thing that we looked at is called the speech system. We looked at how, so as I said, this is from the earlier slide. So, we are just cutting it off and just putting new things into it. So, next we focused on something called the speech system. And so, what is the speech system? In the speech system we looked at what is a spectrogram and what does a spectrogram depict. So, spectrogram is basically a measure of the spoken sound that we produce, and it is in a display form. Now, we looked at how prosody, which is the perceived modulation of speakers fundamental frequency, how it is produced and what meaning does it has in auditory perception. We looked at how vowels and consonants are defined in terms of formants and sorents, the transition between formants and sorents. So, what is this formants? This is the transition, this is the speech sound, or this is the display of the speech, or the extent of speech sound that's there. We looked at how speech is continuous in nature, and they don't the speech sound is not discrete, but it is continuous in nature. We looked at how speech perception system relies on context to fill up missing sound. So, we looked at how speech is dependent on context, and so what we speak and what is perceived, they differ by the context. So, what you speak is placed into a particular context, and this makes you understand what a speech is saying. And we also looked at how the McGurk effect states that not only vocal speech, but body movements integrate with each other to basically produce speech, or to basically perceive speech. The next thing that we will be looking at is looking at the development of speech perception. How speech perception is developed in children. So, development of speech perception in children. We looked at how fetuses in the third trimester itself can hear. We looked at how infant directed speech which has higher fundamental frequency and broader ranges, these are used for teaching small infants to perceive speech. We looked at how prosodic bootstrapping is used by infants to cut out parts of speech or to dissipate parts of speech in terms of words and morphemes and phonemes and that kind of thing. So, basically the prosodic bootstrapping hypothesis proposes that infants use the intonations and stress patterns to infer the phase and the phrase and word boundaries. They understand what is where the word ends and the next word starts. We also looked at something called metrical segment, which is that how the onset of a stress syllable that explains the start of a new word. We also looked at how transitional probabilities help in infants in understanding word boundaries and phrase boundaries, and we also looked at how infants are born with this ability to develop or understand speech. Lastly, we focused on something called theories of speech perception. So, we looked at 3 different theories of speech perception. We looked at something called motor theory. We looked at something called the general auditory framework, and we looked at something called the direct realism theory. So, what is the motor theory? Now, theories of speech perception was proposed to explain the lack of invariance problem which is the fact that what you speak and what is heard are two different things. So, what does the motor theory says? Motor theory says that the lack of invariance problem is taken care by the fact that the acoustic signal is not the meaning of any speech, but the vocal gesture which is produced by producing speech is the intended meaning of any speech. And so, they take care of this invariance problem by that. So, what is speak is not important, what vocal gestures are produced is more important, is what they believe. The general auditory framework, they believe that speech perception overcomes the lack of invariance by suggesting that we make use of contextual cues, including information from other senses. So, they say that cues from the context in which we are perceiving the speech and input from other senses like the eyes or body language, they help us in producing speech or perceiving speech. And the last is the idea of direct realism. It is based on the discovery of mirror neurons which are active when both performing and perceiving a speech, and it says that by just looking at a speech act in progress we can perceive speech. So, that is what we looked at in the section on speech perception. Now, once we had an idea of how speech is produced, speech is perceived, how somebody hears speech and makes meaning out of speech, the spoken language, the next obvious thing was to look at how speech is produced for that matter. What is the way in which speech production happens? And so, we dwell into the idea of speech production, and we started by looking at the idea of the vocal tract and the production of speech. So, how is the vocal tract made and how is the production of speech happens? We looked at that the oral and vocal cavities, how these oral and vocal cavities helps in producing speech, and looking at the resonating chambers, the vocal tract, the resonating box, how all of these combine together to produce the speech which is there. We looked at how consonants and vowels are produced. We looked particularly in consonants, we looked at the manner of articulation and the place of articulation, how this leads to production of consonants. Obviously, the difference between consonants and vowels are produced without obstructing the speech stream, which basically means that the vibrating resonance which is coming from the vocal tract, this is not obstructed in any manner, whereas consonants is produced by obstructing this vocal tract. So, we looked at different type of consonants. We looked at how three determining factors are responsible or play a role in producing consonants. For example, the place of articulation, the manner of articulation and the voicing. In the place of articulation for producing consonants, we looked in detail into the lips, the teeth, the alveolar ridge, the hard palate and the velum, and how they produce different kind of consonants. In the manner of articulation, we looked at things like complete stop, construction and diversion of the air stream as the manner of articulation, and they produce how they produce the consonants. In terms of vowel, as I said, vowels are produced by not obstructing the speech stream. So, the speech or the vibrations which is coming from the vocal tract, they are not obstructed in any manner. So, we looked at how by modifying the shape of the oral cavity, the factors of the height of the jaw, the position of the tongue and the shape of the lip, they produce the vowel. So, jaw, teeth and position and the tongue, they interact together to produce the different vowels that we have. We also looked at what is a diphthong, and we also looked at how diphthongs are combinations of vowels, but they sound like a single vowel. So, in detail we looked at how consonants and vowels are produced and what are the ways of producing consonants and vowels, and we also in detail looked at how speech is produced for that matter. Next, we looked at speech areas in the brain, the different kind of speech areas in the brain, and there we focused in detail with something called the Wernicke and Geschwand model, and we looked at how the Wernicke and Geschwand model says that the Wernicke area is responsible for speech production. So, this says that Wernicke area is responsible for speech production and the Broca area is mainly for the Wernicke is for speech perception and Broca is for speech production, and this Wernicke and Broca area are connected by something called the acute fasciculus, which is the fiber which is connecting between these two speech streams. So, speech area in the brain, generally the Wernicke and Broca area, and how they are, what functions they have and how they are connected with each other. Now, the Wernicke the Wernicke Geschwand model explains why different kind of dyslexias aphasias can occur in speech stream. We also looked at other cerebral areas or cerebral cortex areas which is responsible for producing speech, and we looked in particularly some areas like the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, which is important not only in speech production but also in motor production. So, that is what we did in this particular section, where we are looking at the different speech areas in the brain. Next, we looked at different models of speech production. What are the different models which define how speech is produced, and current models of speech production are built on the findings of neuroimaging studies. So, we looked at some of the neuroimaging studies and we looked at how different models are there. We looked at how speech production, they recruit many areas in the brain involved in moving the limbs, the motor system, and into the feedback and feed forward system. We also looked at some jaw perturbation studies and auditory perturbation studies, that somatosensory feedback is also necessary for speech production. So, not only the feedback and feed forward and looking at the motor system can tell you speech production, but speech production is also taking input from somatosensory feedback. Now, there is a forward model, feed forward model, which proposes that motor systems, in addition to generating the motor plan, generates expected sensory consequence of that motor plan. So, feed forward model says that the motor area, they produce the motor plan and they generate this sensory feedback also. There is something called the dual stream model of language processing that proposes a ventral stream for the auditory cortex to the temporal lobe interprets the meaning of the incoming speech. So, temporal lobe, so from auditory cortex to temporal lobe, it interprets the meaning of the incoming speech, and then there is a dorsal stream. So, this is called the ventral stream, and there is a dorsal stream from the auditory cortex to the frontal lobe. It links the motor programs. So, it monitors the motor programs or provides somatosensory feedback to the speech stream. So, we looked at that particular kind of thing. So, the dual process model. And lastly, we looked at something called the DIVA model, which is a computational model, and it incorporates the latest comes from the latest neuroimaging data. It conceptualizes this. So, basically the DIVA model focuses on the Broca area, and what it says is the Broca area as a speech sound map linking system. So, it says that the perception and production of speech is done both by the Broca area. It also accounts for infant speech production and adult speech production, and what the DIVA model says that it happens through the same system. And lastly, we looked at how development of speech production happen in children. So, we looked at that in the first 6 months, infant produce varieties of speech like sounds with the onset of canonical babbling, and the child begins to produce clearly perceived consonant vowels. So, we looked at how development happens. So, the first thing was looking at babbling and the stages of babbling and how babbling leads to production of speech. We then looked at something called the frame then content model, a theory which explains babbling in terms of repeated jaw movements, and how this frame and content model leads to the idea that speech production or speech is how the infants develop speech. We looked at how caregivers imitate the baby's babbling, and this social feedback helps the infant refine their idea of speech production. We also looked at how delays in babbling can lead to lower levels of speech production or slower speech production in infants, and that is where we ended this section on speech production. So, by the time we had completed the 4 lectures, we had an idea of what is language, we had an idea of how research is done in language, and we also had an idea of how speech is not only perceived, but it is produced. So, of course, we had some details about the idea of language or the idea of speech production and speech perception and a little bit of the history of language. We shifted gears here and moved on to the idea of words. Now, most spoken speech or written speech, they composed of words, and so word is the interface between either spoken language. So, it is a way station, I would say, spoken language, written language, or any other form of language which is there. So, words are the central part, because words are what is exchanged. When we speak, we exchange words. So, obvious question was looking at words, and so we started off by looking at the anatomy of words. What are words like? We looked at how words are minimal units of meaningful speech that can be produced in isolation. So, this is meaningful speech, and this is how the minimal, this is the minimal unit of meaningful speech. We also looked at how words have dual nature of phonological nature, which is the pronunciation of it, and a semantic nature or semantic representation, which is the meaning. So, the phonetic nature is the pronunciation of a word and the semantic nature is the meaning. For example, look at the word dog. Now, the pronunciation is dog and the semantic nature is the four-legged animal, which is basically man's best friend, barks, and so on and so forth. So, how words have these two dual natures. We looked at the content, the different types of word which are there. We looked at how content words and functional words are there, and we looked at how content word they convey bulk of the meaning in the world and how the functional word are just used for syntax. So, content words are words like dog, hat, cat, rat, something like that, and functional words are the words which combine these are used for syntactic structures. For example, is, the, of, on, over, these are content words. So, how they are words which provide structure to sentences and how content words actually mean everything in this world. We also looked at how words they shape their they change their shape according to the morphology. So, depending on the context the word they shape their meaning. We also looked at how words spoken in isolation consist of phonemes grouped together into one or more syllables and how they help us in defining boundaries. We also looked at something called the symbol grounding problem, which is basically the problem which suggests that how do words attain the symbolic meaning that they have. And so, there we looked at the idea of cognitive approach and some different approaches which basically suggest that how words attain the meaning that they have. Now, once we had a little bit of idea of the anatomy of a word, we moved into the idea of how words are learned, and there we looked at vocabulary acquisition through the lifespan. They follow a S shape, and we looked at how children initially they learn slowly, but then there is a period from 8 weeks to 4 weeks, I think 2 years to 6 years, where the spurt is very high, they learn a lot of words and then it decreases down. Now, we looked at how word learning happens. We looked at how word learning is a 3-part process. It starts with constructing a concept, learning the phonological form of it, and creating this concept and making a link. So, word learning starts by learning this concept of dog, then learning the pronunciation of dog. So, this concept of dog and the pronunciation of dog and then linking them together. We also looked at how some words are learned very quickly by children through fast mapping, and some word takes time for learning. We also looked at the challenge for word learning from referential uncertainty or knowing what aspects of current situation novel word refers to. We looked at the idea of referential ambiguity and how this referential ambiguity has to do with learning of words. And lastly, we looked at various characteristics of word forms such as word frequency, neighborhood density, and so on and so forth. They combine together to help us in learning a word. Once we had some idea of how words are learned, we moved on to looking at how words are generally stored. So, what is the way in which different words are stored? We looked at how words are stored permanently into long term memory and the mental lexicon, and in terms of the pronunciation and the meaning. We looked at how the mental lexicon only stores the lemma form of a word, which is the basic form of the word, and how this lemma form then regenerates other forms of the word. We looked at how the mental lexicon is arranged in terms of network of words and the two basic forms of arrangement, the taxonomic arrangement and the thematic arrangement. That is how the words are stored into the mental lexicon. And we found that the taxonomic and the taxonomic and the categorical arrangement, how various studies, experimental studies in terms of the word association test, the semantic priming test, they provide evidences that this kind of format of storing is there. And lastly, we looked at how words are retrieved. So, basically how words are retrieved from long term memory. We looked at how word recognition, it involves extracting phonological form from the speech stream. So, first the phonological form is retrieved from the speech stream, and then they, by way of linking them to the mental lexicon, the meaning of the word is retrieved. Now, the spoken word recognition has three process. It's a three process thing. The first, the lexical access is there. The acoustic signal is matched to this candidate. Then the lexical access is there, in which the best candidate based upon the context of expectation is there, and the third is the lexical integration, where the symbol, the linking of the word with its meaning is happening. So, how words are retrieved? We looked at the cohort model of word recognition, and what it proposes, that a cohort of candidate is generated, and from that the best candidate or the best word is taken. We looked at models of word production. Has two general features or two stages, the lexical stage and the phonological encoding stage. We looked at the feed forward model of word production and the Dell interactive model. In the feed forward model, we looked at how information flows in one direction from one lexical selection to phonological selection, and in addition to this, through Levitt, which says that there is also a feedback chain to it. And then we also looked at the Dell interactive model, which says that there are three layers of semantic, word and phonemic, and how spreading activation connects them together. So, that is what we looked at in terms of the model of word production and word, all about word in terms of its learning, in terms of its storage, and in terms of its retrieval. Now, words are not the only thing, because when we talk, we generally do not use just words. We take these words and we put it into longer sentences. So, next obvious thing was to look at what are sentences and some properties of sentences. So, we started looking at what are sentences, and we started that by looking at sentence structure. So, we look at the sentence processing. How does it happen? It happens first at the conceptual level, which is the intended message, then at the syntactic level, which is the structure of a sentence, and the third is in the phonological level, which is the spoken sentence. So, any sentence processing helps in this way. Now, at the conceptual level, what happens is, sentences are description of events, and the nature of event determines the type of the participants, the thematic role, and so on and so forth. At the syntactic level, the basic components of sentences are the subject, verb, object, clauses, and so on and so forth. And at the phonological level, the spoken form of the sentence is produced. It entails programs for syllabication, the assignment of stresses, the intonation, and so on and so forth. We also looked at how noun phrase and verb phrase are there, how noun phrase consists of a noun plus any determiners, and a verb phrase consists of a main verb plus any auxiliary verb related to it. We also look at what a clause is in terms of a simple sentence consisting of verb and its arguments. Then, once we had some idea of how sentence structures are there, we started looking at how sentence comprehension happens. How do we comprehend sentences? And in this, we looked at models of sentence comprehension, and we looked at how these models of sentence comprehension can be divided into two-stage model and the one-stage model. In the two-stage model, the syntactic analysis and the semantic interpretation happens at two different stages, and in the one-stage model, the syntactic interpretation and the semantic interpretation happen at the same stage. We looked at how heuristics help us in comprehending sentences, and two main kind of heuristics that we looked at is something called the late closure, which says that the subject verb object is the format of any English language, and the minimal attachment heuristic. These are the two heuristics which are used in sentence comprehension. And so, what is the minimal attachment? It says that the phrases are organized according to the simplest possible structure. Though the simplest possible structure is used in terms of arranging the phrases. So, how these two kind of heuristics are used in comprehending sentences. We also looked at how many sentences are structurally ambiguous, but syntactic priming can bias the listener towards one particular form of the sentence. So, that is how we looked at, or that is what we looked at in terms of comprehending sentences. Of course, we also looked at little bit into the electrophysiology of it and the ERPs, but I am not discussing that here. So, if you can refer back to the lecture and look at it. So, this is the review lecture. So, we will be keeping things at the minimal level. We looked at how producing sentences happens, how sentences are produced, and we looked at how as we produce sentences, the information flows in two dimensions. The vertical dimension represents the processing of individual words, from conceptual activation through lexical access to phonological encoding, and the horizontal refers to linked processes of producing word and phrases in the right sequence. So, the horizontal is looking at words and sequences in a manner, and in the vertical dimension it is words to the conceptual activation to the lexical access and so on and so forth, how these two dimensions are out there. We looked at how sentence production is incremental in nature. So, when we plan a sentence, we do not plan the sentences ahead, we say something, and based on the feedback we keep on increasing the sentence. We also looked at scope of planning in a sentence and how the scope provides evidences to sentence producing efforts, and we looked at the inconsistency of scope of planning data in terms of experimental procedure and how they bias participants towards one scope. Also, planning scope may be varying according to the processing demand, and also how different levels of processing may have different scopes for producing a sentences. And lastly, we were interested in looking at the syntactic structures, how learning of syntactic structures actually happen. We looked at how infants use the prosodic patterns. Prosody is the intonation, the ups and downs, the way speech is spoken, how infants use these prosodic patterns to group words into phrases in a process called the prosodic bootstrapping. So, by looking at the ups and downs in the speech, how infants use this in finding out the structure of a sentence. So, how this prosodic thing is used. Also, vocabulary and syntax develops in parallel during the early years. So, we understood that this syntax development and vocabulary development happens at the same time, and they reinforce each other in children. Now, children use syntactic bootstrapping to inferred meaning. So, children use syntactic bootstrapping, which is basically understanding the sentence for learning new words, and they use the lexical bootstrapping for understanding new structures. So, how children use the syntactic and the lexical bootstrapping for understanding new words and new structures. We looked at the generative approach, which argues that language acquisition is driven by innate language specific abilities, and we also looked at the usage based approach framework, which says that children use cognitive mechanisms to gradually understand the grammar of a particular word. We looked at how specific language impairment involves in the deficit on the use of certain grammatical morphemes, and what they suggest in terms of learning syntactic structures in children. And lastly, we looked at how recent neuroimaging studies show that language processing is bilateral in infancy, but gradually lateralizes to left hemisphere by the early school year. So, we looked at how this language syntactic structures of sentences are learned by smaller children. So, once we had an idea of what a language is, and we had an idea of what words are, and how we had an idea of what sentences are, and how sentences are used for exchanging words, obviously sentences do not mean everything. Sentences, if you produce a sentence, the next sentence comes in, and this is what is discourses. And the next thing that we were interested in looking at, what are discourses. So, we started looking at the idea of a discourse. We started with looking at conversation. So, first of all, we started looking at what is discourse, by the way. And so, discourse is a set of sentences that cohere about one or more related topics. So, it is basically sentences produced for and against, or two people producing sentences onto a related topic. Conversation is the most basic form of discourse, and it has an added feature of being a collaborative process between two or more participants who take turn. So, consensus is when people exchange words or sentences between each other and they take turn in doing so. Conversation is replete with ill-formed sentences and they are vague references. Conversation patterns underlie each other because they have recourse to pragmatics. Also, participants in a conversation, they take turn. So, when in a conversation somebody speaks and somebody else speaks, and that is how conversation progresses. Also, the listeners play an active role in conversation by providing the speaker with a black channel by indicate points of understanding. So, listeners in a conversation, they nod, they produce some kind of a feedback which gives the speaker some kind of a back channel that the conversation should progress. We also looked at how turn allocation is decided in a conversation in terms of the current speaker selecting the next speaker, or in terms of listeners self-selecting themselves as the next speaker, or the current speaker self-selects through the process of cycle of 2 and 3, and so how this turn allocation happens. Finally, we focused on the participants in a conversation tend to match each other in terms of body movements, breathing rate and so on and so forth. So, how they are in sync, not only in terms of the conversational structure, but in terms of the body movement, the heart rates, the speech stream and everything, how the in a conversation how people are in sync. The next thing obviously was looking at narratives, which is another form of conversation. So, we looked at what are narratives. Now, conversations and narratives form two ends of a discourse. So, and discourse has two parts. We have something called conversation, where everybody speaks, and a narrative when one person speaks and the other listens to him. Now, in case of conversation, the interlocutor take turns in constructing a discourse. So, most people speak in a conversation, and in a discourse, in a narrative, one interlocutor dominates as a narrator, although listeners still play an important role. So, once somebody speaks and the other person looks at it. So, we are looking at what are narratives. We looked at how storytelling, which is a form of narrative, is cognitively demanding, because the speaker and the listener need to distance themselves away from here and now. They have to go into the reference of the story. Also, how we looked at how story grammars, they provide the framework for narratives. A story consists of one or more episodes that depend on the construction and comprehension of the schemas. Next, we focus on something called references, which is the process of using a word or phrase to represent an entity. Speakers need to judge what is in common or privileged ground and what crafting referring expressions are used. We looked at the relevance theory, which proposes that speakers try to strike a balance between too much and too little information in selecting referring expressions. So, how this referring expression has some role to play in narratives, and we also looked at how interlocutors collaborate to hone referring expressions and how clinical studies provide evidences to such kind of effect. The next we focused on something called anaphora and how anaphora and inferences are related together. So, what is an anaphora? Anaphora is a word or phrase that refers back to an antecedent in a discourse. So, this is a word or a phrase which refers back to an antecedent in a discourse, and a antecedent in a discourse, and so basically the pronoun is a good example of an anaphora. Now, anaphoras are memory retrieval crew, and the proper use of anaphora, they considerably eases the listener's comprehension of any discourse. We looked at different types of anaphoras that speakers choose, depends on the part of the antecedents which is given to them. We looked at the cohesion theory, which says that cohesion refers to the use of linguistic devices such as anaphoras to build sentences in a discourse. So, how cohesion uses anaphora to form a discourse. We looked at the speech act theory, which proposes that the value of an utterance should be judged not by its literal meaning, which is the location, but rather by the intention of the speaker, which is the the elocation. So, what a person says is not the meaning of it, a speech act or a speech, but what is the intention of the speaker should also be taken care of, and the effect that it has on the listener, the prelocation, the prelocation. So, the prelocation, the elocation and the location all combine together to give meaning to a speech. We also looked at an indirect speech act is an utterance whose literal and intended meaning are different. Indirect speech acts are often used to express politeness. So, how indirect speech acts are also used as a form of inferences, as a form of discourse. And lastly, we looked at the Grasim's cooperative principle and how they guideline the idea of a speech. And lastly, we focused on something called the development of discourse ability. So, how development of discourse ability happens. We looked at how turn taking behavior of conversation is learned in infancy during face to face interaction by the caregiver. We looked at how some small children with developmental language delay eventually catch up with the peers, and so what happens after that. We also looked at two types of co-speech gestures, which are indexual gesture and the iconic gesture, and what do they mean in terms of development of discourse ability. We also looked at how children are sensitive to emotional contents or the prosody when hearing in isolation, and how they tend to ignore when it conflicts with the semantic of the utterances. We looked at the Grasim's maxim sometimes leads for the adult to make inferences not in a logical way, and finally looked at certain kind of language deficits and what they tell us about the development of discourse ability. Now, once we had some meaning of what is a discourse or how spoken languages are treated, because up till now we have only been dealing with spoken languages, we jumped on to understanding the written and reading and writing, the written form of languages. So, how does reading and writing come up? And so, there we focused on what is reading and writing, how do they come up. We looked at that how the brain was never dedicated to writing, and they have specific the brain does have specific dedicated area for speech production, but it has no area for reading and writing. We also looked at how there are 3 different writing systems in the world. We have something called the logographic, which is the Chinese form. We have something called the syllabary systems, which is like the Japanese and the Korean form, and we have the alphabet, which is the English form. So, the logographic system, it uses symbols to represent words or morphemes. The syllabaries represent each possible syllable of a language with a different symbol, and the alphabets represent language at the phoneme level, at the sound level. Now, we also looked at what is an orthography, which is a set of rules for writing the words of a different language. We looked at how we can have different languages with a shallow orthography, for example, Spanish, and a deep orthography, for example, English. We looked at what are homophones and what are homographs. We also looked at the visual word form area, which is the region at the boundary between the inferior temporal lobe and the parietal lobe, and how they helps us in understanding the different shapes while writing a language. We the observation that all writing systems are processed by the same way in the brain is explained in terms of the neuronal recycling hypothesis, which proposes the brain area designed for one function can be recruited to perform somewhat singular function. And so, how this neuronal recycling hypothesis suggests that writing systems are newer systems, writing or reading systems are newer systems, and they make use of certain brain area which was dedicated for some other purpose. Next, we looked at the cognitive processes in reading. So, what are the various cognitive processes in reading? We looked at how the eye movements, they explain reading, and in reading can be explained in terms of the saccades and fixations, and how skilled readers read. We looked at the visual acuity. What is visual acuity? And we define visual acuity is limited to a small region of the retina behind the pupil known as the fovea. The area around the fovea known as the parafovea also provides the blurred image. We also looked at the range of letters that can be taken in during one fixation of the eye is known as the perceptual span. So, we defined what is perceptual span. Actually, reading is about moving from word to word, and the two processes, one is called fixation, the other is called saccade. Fixation is when you are fixating on a particular word, and saccade is when you are jumping around words. Now, we looked at how fixation duration is influenced by the characteristic of the currently fixated word, such as frequency and predictability. We also looked at how the dual root model proposes that lexical accesses in reading can occur through a direct route linking the written word to its meaning, or else through a indirect route in which the word's phonology is first accessed. So, there is a direct route of linking a word to the lexical access through meaning, and there is an indirect route where the first the pronunciation is taken care of, and then the meaning is linked. And lastly, we also looked at how the inner voice is there when we actually read, and how this inner voice helps us in reading. What is the meaning of this inner voice? We looked at how the development of reading skills happens, and there we looked at reading skill involves not only quickly accessing the meaning and pronunciation of visual word form, but also includes the ability to move quickly through a text when maintaining good comprehension. We also looked at how reading skills are normally distributed among the population. We looked at developmental dyslexia as a reading disability in children, and how they provide some evidences to development of reading skills. We looked at phonological awareness or sensitivity to the sound structure or the word as an essential prerequisite to learning, and we looked at some brain studies which give us some idea on the development of reading skill in children. And lastly, we focused on something called the cognitive process in writing. So, we started looking at how learning to write the letters of a writing system involves changes in two areas of the brain, which is the visual word form area at the occipital temporal juncture of the brain, and stores the visual, and the external area which is in the frontal lobe, and motor plans for handwriting. So, how symbol is produced in the occipital area and how it is linked to the external area, which provides the motor access for handwriting. Learning to spell requires integration of three types of information. We looked at the phonological structure of word, the orthographic rule for converting spoken words into written form, and the morphological information about how word forms can change. So, these three things are necessary for producing spellings. We looked at the Hayes model as a theory of cognitive processes which is involved in the writing task and guided writing research more than 3 decades. So, how the Hayes theory is out there explaining the cognitive process of writing. We also looked at how visual spatial areas or the text are important to skilled writers who organizes paragraphs based on how they laid out on the page and use of spatial memory and location of spatial memory for writing. So, up till this point we had a lot of understanding about what is language, the psychology behind language, and the various functions of language or the various features of language. And so, we thought why not deal one more point, which is the idea of bilingualism, of how people with two languages exist. So, we started by looking at what is the bilingual experience. We looked at how many people of the world are bilingual in nature and they speak two languages at the same time. We looked at the bilingual world and the different dialects of the bilingual world. We looked at how mutual intelligibility and several other factors help in bilingualism. We looked at how multigeneral bilinguals are out there, and we also looked at something called code switching, which is using words from both the languages in either in a single utterance or in multiple utterances, and how this code switching helps children, bilingual children, in some way. We also looked at how language provides identity to some people. We then focused on the organization of the bilingual mind. We looked at how both languages activate in a bilingual, how both the languages are activated in the brain of bilinguals every time they speak, regardless of the fact that which language they are currently using. We also looked at transitional equivalents are words of two languages and they refer to the same concepts and how they provide some idea of the bilingual mind. We looked at how bilinguals have fewer vocabularies in each language and what kind of difficulty can the bilingual disadvantage, what kind of difficulty that the bilinguals can have. We also looked at weaker link hypothesis, which explains that bilingual disadvantage by suggesting that bilinguals are less practiced at using words they know, since they need to split the time between two languages in and that is one disadvantage that bilinguals have. We looked at the revised hierarchical model, which proposed a separate lexicon for each language, which links to a common conceptual level. We also looked at translation occurs either by passing through one conceptual level or via direct links between the two languages. We also looked at something called the sense model, which takes into account the fact that most words have multiple meanings and do not fully overlap across languages. An extension of this model is also takes into account the cultural difference into imagery evoked by words. So, this is how the bilingual mind is organized. We started looking at the cognitive benefits of bilingualism. So, bilinguals ability to quickly and accurately switch from one language to another language carries over to the non-verbal cognitive tasks. So, how this bilingual ability helps in other cognitive tasks. Living with two languages also lead to better understanding about the nature of the language. This is called the meta-linguistic awareness. We also looked at the bilingual advantage in non-verbal tasks as based on the three cognitive skills, for example, the interference inhibition, the selective attention and the mental flexibility, and how these three processes work together produce the executive control. We looked at lifelong bilinguals generally outperform monolinguals on test of executive control and how this is an advantage. We looked at how there are structural brain differences between lifelong bilinguals and monolinguals account for the bilingual advantage. We looked at the phenomena of cognitive reserve, which is which refers to the ability to resist the debilitating effects of dementia in old age, and so how bilinguals have this advantage. And finally, we looked at, despite the concerns of many practitioners, raising children with language disorders or bilingual causes no additional delay in learning ability. And lastly, we focused on how the second language acquisition happens in bilinguals. So, we looked at the ultimate attainment in second language acquired through puberty. So, how puberty is the cut-off point. So, if you learn the second language before puberty, the accents you would have the original language accent, and how if you attain the language after puberty, although you have ultimate attainment, which is basically you develop the second language just before its mastery or little bit before its mastery, but still you will not be able to have the correct accent. The critical period hypothesis explains the effect that age of arrival on ultimate attainment of second language acquisition by proposing the children have a biological predisposition to learn the languages. We looked at how the speech learning model explains ultimate attainment in a second language in terms of time spent in the two languages in the communicative context. We looked at how some bilingual children, they grow up in homes where each parent speaks different languages, and so how parental home environment can be made in, or can be made more supportive for bilinguals. We looked at two approaches for bilingual education. For example, translational programs aim to assimilate heritage language of the student into the mainstream. So, we looked at the translational program and the two-way immersion program, of how these two different programs can help bilinguals, and we looked at how adults and children bilinguals, they compete with each other, and how children and adults bilinguals, they have this this kind of the children have some kind of advantage over adult children. Bilinguals have some kind of advantage over adults in terms of learning the second language, and so that brings an end to this particular course on the psychology of language. We have traveled through a lot, and I have discussed a lot with you here, reviewed everything that we did here. Now, this course was designed for people who want to learn a little bit about language. So, if you go through the course and the notes which are provided with the course, you will have a better understanding about the course, and not only the better understanding, but since this course was not dedicated to linguistics as such, it was a course on understanding the basics of language, or basics of the psychology of language. So, the course should be dealt in that manner. It should be dealt in a very superficial manner, in a very superficial manner, and the course should be taken in that manner. If you take the course in that manner, in a very light manner, you will certainly learn something from the course, and something about language and the psychology of language. So, what I would suggest is not to go into too much details into each topic, and just refer to the lectures and the notes provided with it, and given that you would learn some amount about the psychology of language, or language for that matter, and can use these principles and in your everyday life. So, given the fact that you look at the lectures, study the notes provided with it, and look at the slides, and do a little bit of research, or follow books which have been provided with it, I think you would do good and fare good, and get good marks in your exam. So, with that hope that you fare good marks, that you come up with good marks in your exam, it is a final goodbye, and thank you from this studios on the MOOC studio at IIT Guwahati. Thank you, goodbye, and good luck.